Hey everybody, welcome to the Paranormal Portal. I hope you guys are doing great. Thank you so much for joining me. I've got an incredible guest joining us today. You guys aren't going to believe this, but it's true. I am joined today by Amy Bruni, who is probably needs no introduction, but I'll give her a little bit of an introduction anyway. Of course, she's from Ghost Hunters, Kindred Spirits with Adam Berry, and has her own podcast called The Haunted Road. And she is here to talk about not only her journey, but her new book, which is coming out July 30th. It's called Food to Die For, Recipes and Stories from America's Most Legendary Haunted Places. So without further ado, let's jump into this. Amy, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's absolutely my pleasure. I've, of course, been watching you for years. I am a pretty ravenous fan of the ghost shows that are on TV, and it's been really wonderful. I guess, you know, kind of one of the only canned question that I ever have on these shows, because I'm always interested in how people got here. How did you get here? Because your life has been incredibly unusual and interesting. How did you get there?
It's very interesting. I fell into it, not the paranormal. Like, the paranormal is something I've been doing for many, many years. I was part of paranormal teams and everything before anyone ever saw me on camera. And that's kind of how I was introduced to the guys from Ghost Hunters. And so that's really when the world met me. It was when I started on Ghost Hunters in 2007. At that point, I had already been investigating the paranormal for many years, and I've been doing different research projects on paranormal teams and paranormal group dynamics, and I was presenting at conferences and whatnot. But I was also producing a paranormal podcast. The team I was on at that point was a TAPS family team.
Oh, sure.
And back then we had something called TAPS Family Radio. And so I was producing that podcast. I was not on air, but I would find the guests and do all the questions and stuff. And so Jay and Grant from Ghost Hunters, they had a radio show way back in the day called Beyond Reality Radio, and they were looking for someone to help them with it. So they reached out to me to see if I would help produce their podcast or radio show. And I was like, yeah, of course. And this time I lived in California, and I had never met them or anything. And just for reference, how long ago this was, Grant reached out to me on MySpace. So that was a long time ago. Wow. And then eventually they came out to film in California near where I was. And I had been working with them for quite a while, but we'd never met in person. And so we met for dinner and stuff, and they came back out a few months later to film some more cases. And at that point, they were like, we need an extra hand on a couple cases. Oh. Do you want to come film with us? And I was like, all right. I was working in health insurance at the time. I was a project manager. I worked in a cubicle. It was just, not that there's anything wrong with that. Sure. There is safety and security in that world that I sometimes envy. But so I went out to film with them, and then I just never went home. I was on the road with Ghost Hunters for like 7 years.
Wow.
Met my partner out here in New England, and he and I fell in love, and then we moved in together, and we had a child, and now our child is 11.
Wow.
So I ended up moving out here, and so it's great. I have my little happy family here. I eventually left Ghost Hunters because it was really hard to travel as much as necessary once I had my daughter. I think she was about 2 at that time. But then Adam and I started Kindred Spirits, a year or 2 later, which was just a lot less time consuming than Ghost Hunters, a lot less aggressive schedule, and we could dictate it and whatnot. And the rest is history. Now I'm just constantly working on new things and investigating, and basically determined to make the paranormal my career in some way, shape, or form forever.
And you've done a marvelous job. First of all, I need to commend you on all of your ventures because I love your approach. I think there's a whole spectrum of people out there doing the paranormal and doing paranormal entertainment and TV, but you guys have always come at it, you and Adam especially, very, I mean, you're so well grounded. You're not sensationalizing anything. You're just going out there and doing it right. I mean, you guys are respectful, not only to the people with the phenomena, but in your approach to the spiritual. And I really think that is amazing and wonderful. And I'm glad that example is out there, because there's a lot of other people that are just, forgive the phrase, but balls to the wall, just like, trigger objects, let's check, come take my energy. And it's like, oh no. And so
well, I really do appreciate that. I mean, we definitely try. Like, this is the one thing I've said, is that the one thing I will never sacrifice to do this is my integrity. Like, and I always tell people, like, if you want to make a go at this for the rest of your life, if you get a TV offer or something like that, don't use that moment to sacrifice your integrity, because there's so much life in the paranormal beyond TV, and people will remember that forever.
Yes.
And, also just in your heart, that feels wrong, right? But I do have I think there is this natural progression of people as investigators, and I think a lot of them start out being like super gung-ho and like really aggressive and like wanting to get activity. And then the people that really stick with it, they start to kind of evolve into more compassionate investigators as the years go by. And I'm noticing that a lot right now, because we have a lot of like younger people in the YouTuber generation and stuff. And, a lot of people kind of harp on that a little bit, but I am like, no, let them have their fun, goofy investigations and their screaming and yelling and ghosts, because from that's going to spawn our next generation of investigators who are going to be like, I actually want to take this a little further. Like, this was really fun, but I know there's more to this. So I never begrudge people who investigate in that way. I'm just kind of like, I just kind of hope it's nice if they come around to how I do things, but I just feel like there's all sorts of different ways to investigate. But I've just found that compassion, respect, and a true want to help and make a difference really changes your investigative style for the better, to me, I think.
I would agree, and I really commend that. But you're right. I mean, there's all kinds of different personality types, so everybody has their own.
There really are. Some don't change.
No, that's true. But I think it's really important, because I think about it, and I try to think about it from a spirit's perspective. Like, they're in this state for whatever reason, and the last thing they need is somebody to go, oh, well, they hung themselves. Well, here's a rope. Let's hang it up here. It's like, oh, God, don't do that.
Yeah. I always tell people, just treat them like they're a living person right in front of you, and you're trying to interview them basically and find out more. What would it take for you to open up about the most, important aspects of your living self? What would someone need to say to you? And sometimes it's really just casual. It's being casual and not super intensive, very smiling. It's not as scary as I think some people think it would be.
Right. But I think your approach is also incredible, because I think one of the big ramifications, of course, is for the people that have to live there. So if you have this team coming in and just provoking, threatening, being loud and boisterous, and again, we assume these things are formerly people, and they're in some state that they're sticking around, and then probably the last thing they need to be is harassed. And then, of course, the team goes home. They go back to their own lives, and then people that live there have to deal with it. So I think your gentle approach has been incredible, not only for the spirits and whatever they're going through, but also the people that are left to reside there, so.
Yeah, it's definitely something you have to think about. You have to leave a place at some point.
Yeah.
But also sometimes you go in, even as nice as you are, with all of these doodads and whatnot, and the spirits are like, wait, we can talk. Oh, and so even if you're super nice, sometimes you leave and the family's like, excuse me. They're very interested in communicating now.
Sure.
So always something to think about before you call investigators into your home. You never know what, you might get what you wish for.
Well, and then the other side of the spectrum is that you don't really know what you're dealing with. But I mean, like you said, there's a full spectrum of people. But I think there's a full spectrum of people that are now spirits, and there's always going to be the get off my lawn guy. It's like,
yeah, there are grumpy ghosts, and beyond that, there are truly evil ghosts. Like, and because there are truly evil people that were alive at one point, they become ghosts too. It's very rare, thankfully, just like you or I. It's very rare we run into somebody that's truly evil, But unfortunately, those kind of spirits do exist. I think people sometimes quickly want to call them demons or inhuman or whatever, because that's sometimes easier to stomach than thinking it could be the ghost of an actual person, Right. So, but that's a whole other conversation.
Yeah, there's a whole, and honestly, I know I could talk to you all day about this because, your experience is incredible, and of course what you presented, and furthering the conversation in a very tasteful way. Was just to go back to the very beginning, if you don't mind briefly, what was there an event in your own life that started you on this paranormal path, or was it just an interest?
Well, I lived in a haunted house as a child, and so I think that's a journey. I think that a lot of people, their journey starts that very same way. But I saw a full-bodied apparition when I was like 8 or 9 years old, standing outside a window of my kitchen. And so where this window was situated, though, that was like a second floor window, so there's no way someone could have been standing there. Right. And so my little brain was like, number one, I was just thinking stranger danger, who is this man? And then I also was like, how is he standing there? That makes no sense. Right. So I ran to get my mom. And she was very matter of fact. She just said to me like, oh yeah, he's a ghost. She's like, I've seen him too. I've been calling him Mr. Green Jeans. and she just said it so matter of factly. Like, yeah, sometimes when people die, they become ghosts. And I was just like, what? Just completely like mind blown, but not scared, because she presented it in this very just kind of like, sometimes it happens. And so that was really what sparked my interest, was living in that house and the things that happened. And I started reading books on it. And, it was back in the 80s. So my mom would just dump me at the library for hours. And I'd go and, read every book they had on spiritualism and Hans Holzer and you name it. And so it just that interest never really waned. My family was very like new agey and kind of like woo woo, So, ghosts and spirits and energy were just something I was really raised around. Mm-hmm. And I was, even like my high school yearbooks, people would call me like the ghost girl and stuff. But yeah, I just never went away.
Well, that was very prophetic, because of course you did turn into a lifelong ghost girl.
A life ghost girl.
Yeah, that's wonderful. So this cookbook, and I can't just call it a cookbook, because I think this approach is brilliant, first of all, because most often when you see a cookbook, you have a book and you look at the index or the table of contents and you go to a page and there you go. That's like the use of it. It's a reference. Mm-hmm. But what you've created is, again, just a beautiful work. First of all, the pictures are incredible, and the backgrounds are really interesting. This is like, for me, and I don't cook, so this is saying something, but this is a book that I would enjoy just because you've got so many elements in there. You talk about the history, you talk about, the locations and what the interest is and what's going on. And then you present these incredible recipes. First of all, I mean, I'm on a diet and you're killing me.
This is not a book for dieting.
No, it's not, but it's just so interesting and well done. So first of all, where did you get this idea? Because I think it's really incredibly novel and in a lot of ways groundbreaking for a cookbook to have such comprehensive information.
Well, thank you. I got the idea, it was just years ago. The Fall River Historical Society posted on social media a photo of Lizzie Borden's meatloaf recipe. And it was her actual recipe card, and it said Lizzie's meatloaf on it. Oh. And I just took one look at that, and I was like, do people make this? Like, what if you actually made this? And it just got me thinking, like, in my brain, because I'm always thinking of like triggering, like what could trigger activity, like paranormal activity, or how could I experience history to its fullest? Because I am obsessed with history and research. And so I was thinking, gosh, if you made this meatloaf, you would be like, according to this recipe, you would be smelling and tasting something exactly like the Bordens did. Like, it's not you like thumbing through photos of them or looking at their house and looking at artifacts. You are experiencing it just like they did. And I kind of brought me to like how so many people like, smells and taste trigger like really intense emotions and things. And so I started thinking like, how many recipes are associated with haunted locations? And I started kind of just collecting them out of curiosity. And then I went to my manager and I said, I have this idea for a cookbook. I said, because I said, I want to make a compilation of recipes from haunted locations and call it Food to Die For. And he was like, I'm going to sell this book. And he sold it to like the first publisher he took it to. They've been so great at HarperCollins. And so they saw my vision, because I always am trying to branch beyond just like I love bringing the paranormal into the mainstream in some ways, And so like this book to me is, it's recipes, obviously, for people who like to cook. It's history for people who love history. It's ghost stories and the paranormal for people who love ghosts and the paranormal. And it's just gorgeously shot, which I cannot take credit for the photos. That was, we had a whole design team. It was a 5-day shoot in Tennessee, and they just killed it. Like, I'm amazed.
Now, did you put Lizzie's recipe in there?
Oh, it's in there. I don't know if you want to make it, but it's in there.
Did you make it?
So we had to test every single recipe. And so, yes, now the funny thing is I'm a pescatarian. I do not eat red meat. And so my writing partner, Julie, she had the tremendous task of making the meaty recipe. So she made the meatloaf, and she swore at me the whole So it's funny because I would say 80 to 90% of these recipes are actually delicious, but there are a few that are like historic, kind of thrown in there, like Neutral Loaf from Eastern State Penitentiary. You probably don't want to make that for company, There's Lizzie Borden's meatloaf, which literally is like, I don't know, for like the legal team came to us after and they were like, you have to either tweak this or put some sort of disclaimer because people could get sick. But yeah, so it's, most of the recipes are delicious, but there are a few historic. The meatloaf I would consider to be one of the more historic ones.
Yeah, the interesting thing is just when you think of the nature of the Lizzie Borden legend, and I'm not really well versed on it, but of course everybody knows that children's tale and stuff, and then you looking at meatloaf at the same time, it's like, oh wow, that's quite a stretch. But
the photo that they did for that, it just kills me. I'll show it. I know the listeners can't see it, but like, this photo of the axe in the meatloaf is just...
Ooh.
And by the way, that is the actual meatloaf made. So yeah, that is one of my favorite photos in the book.
Brilliant, actually.
Yeah, so we did, we added a few notes to that one, just, so people...
And all of these recipes are actually from the region or these locations directly, huh?
Yes, and some of them are a little more modern because maybe the place is now like a restaurant or something like that. Sure. And then others are from like regional. Like we have Villisca cornbread from Villisca, Iowa. For
Sure.
the Villisca house, or the Myrtles. They gave me their croissant bread pudding recipe, which is like literally to die for. It is so delicious. And and so there's certain things that came like directly from it, like the Waverly Hills tuberculosis soup. It's like a veggie soup, which is actually really good.
Oh, okay.
Who knew? Yeah.
So of these many locations, Do you have personal favorites that you covered in the book?
I have many. The Mount Washington Hotel is one of my favorite places in the whole wide world in New Hampshire. And I think it's probably the most haunted place I've ever been. I've investigated it dozens of times at this point. So they're high up on the list. There's so many, obviously. The Stanley Hotel is in there, which I love. The Hemingway House in Key West, Florida, which I think a lot of people don't really think about as being haunted, but there are a lot of haunted stories that come out of there. I love the Old City Jail in Charleston, South Carolina. Like you name it, it's in there. The Queen Mary, Tombstone, Arizona, which is one of my favorite places. So yeah, there's a lot. There's two from Tombstone, really, because there's Big Nose Kate's Saloon and then Tombstone, Arizona on its own. So,
yeah, the whole place is probably pretty electric. I've not been, but
you have to go. We're going with Strange Escapes in February, so you got to go.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I will try to be there if I can. That would be amazing. Do you, throughout the course of your journey, have you come to any conclusions about this spirit stuff and this ghost stuff? I mean, it's obviously an unanswerable question, but just out of your own experience, what do you think is going on with this stuff?
It depends on the type of activity. I find I have a few different theories. I mean, I will never speak in absolutes. I will never tell people I know exactly what a ghost is, but I will convey like what I theorize just from my many experiences. I do think a lot of ghosts are kind of that classic, like holdover from life, energy, unfinished business, that kind of thing. But I think there's a lot that we do energetically that influences activity. I think it's probably surprising, like how many ghosts we create. And I think that there's a lot of locations that people may investigate over and over again, and they just leave a little bit of themselves behind each time. And like that little bit that they leave behind is actually like kind of nervous and on edge and thinking about really terrible things. And like, I think those are called like egregores. Those can become something on their own. Or even our moods can influence already existing paranormal activity. So I think there's a lot at play. Personally. And then there's stuff that happens where I'm just like, I don't know. I got no explanation, and I've had quite a few of those moments. That's why I'm always like, I'll never tell you what a ghost is, because the more I do this, the more activity kind of changes and surprises me. But also just the less I feel like I know, if that makes sense. When I went into it, I was like, oh, a ghost is someone who died and they are here for whatever reason and they need to be put into the light, Carol Ann, and that is not at all what it is. So, but it's funny how many people message me online still with that viewpoint, very matter-of-factly, and it's, which is fine. But yeah, I just think that there's so much more to this universe that we'll ever know.
It's interesting that you say that, because when I had this idea in 2016 of the Paranormal Portal, which obviously became my show, but I was like, oh, I can do a show about the paranormal. I know about this stuff. And then you go down the rabbit hole and you're like, oh my God, I had no idea that there's so many layers. I mean, it's the literal onion with the infinite onion, I guess, because you go through maybe coming to some conclusions, and then something will happen. It just throws it all on its head, and it's mind numbing.
It is. There's so much to it. And I try to explain that sometimes, like I get approached a lot from like producers and things wanting to do shows and or wanting to do this or that. And I think sometimes people from the outside look at the paranormal like it's this very simplistic thing, like, oh, I can just get some pictures of orbs and I prove the existence of ghosts, or and I don't think they realize how multifaceted it is and how intense and dedicated real fans of the paranormal are. And it's not easy to throw a curveball. It's not easy to to trick them. They could see past the people who think they can just walk in and be an expert. So it's a really in-depth field for certain.
Yeah, and it seems to as you alluded to earlier, it's like, I mean, the phenomena even seems to evolve. And maybe it's our understanding that's evolving or our own experience. But how many locations do you visit that you feel are probably more residual? Well, I don't mean how many, but let's talk about the locations in the book. Obviously, there's two primary thoughts, that there's the intelligent haunts and the residual haunts. And do you find that most of these locations embody both of these things, or do you think most of these are intelligent and aware, or what are your thoughts on that?
I think it just depends on the location. Some of these places have had such intense kind of tragedy and whatnot in their history. It's hard to imagine that there's any one type of activity, right? And then there's others that I just feel like are just, heavily influenced by like one event. Again, bringing up the Villisca house, because that's one that I feel like I've been there many times and investigated it. And, I feel like it's so heavily defined by like this one horrible thing that happened there. And I always try to encourage people to remember that the power of and energy of everything that happened there before is probably much stronger than that one moment, that one night. Before that, there were birthdays and Christmases and births and parties and happiness and family and playing. Like, that's the energy that's probably in that house, not the energy of that one terrible night. But people go in over and over again, bringing up that one terrible night, So sure. I think that those kind of haunts, it might be more residual in nature, but that's also the kind where I think sometimes people just kind of create something that isn't really there to begin with, with their own energy and fixation on something. So yeah, it runs the gamut, depending on what it is. Some of the places I think are so steeped in lore, like unprovable history, right, that it almost becomes its own ghost. You know what I mean? Like places like the Myrtles, again, bringing that up just because that one's fresh in my brain. But, there's this whole story there that none of it has been proven, but yet they still recite it over and over. Even the tour guides recite it over and over every day. And it's really traced back to having been kind of made up by someone at some point. Not to say the place is not haunted, but these people never even really existed that they tell stories about every day. But hey, you can speak them into existence, I think.
Right. I think that's a very powerful statement, and that's something I've been pondering a lot lately, actually. So it's kind of neat that you went down this road as well. But I keep thinking, I believe that we are incredible manifestors of our experience, and as such, when you think of the poltergeist phenomena, which is believed by many parapsychologists to be generated by a living person, but I wonder exactly what you're saying. It's like, well, how many of these haunting experiences are actually being generated by, often with poltergeist, it's attributed to a young, oftentimes prepubescent or pubescent girl, but how many people are manifesting their own hauntings via their expectations and stuff? And I know there's no way to answer that, but I find it interesting that what you're saying is echoing that. It's like, yeah, because I think there's got to be something to that.
I think so. And just kind of going back on like the people bring up that theory about poltergeists a lot, about it being young women or young girls. And the reality is it happens around all sorts of people. But it does say historically, like, as I have a tween myself right now, what I go through in this house, I wish I could just say it was a poltergeist. But I do. But yeah, I think that's funny. Now that I have a tween, I'm like, oh, now I know why people blame poltergeists on them. I get it.
It's got to be Becky. Yeah, it's got to be.
It's got to be it.
That's hilarious.
But I digress, which I'm very good at doing.
No, that's wonderful. I just think it's fascinating, and with your body of experience and all of the places that you've been. I mean, you've been everywhere. And do you feel, as you talked about a little bit before, but do you feel that some places are just evil, like a location is just evil?
No.
Okay.
I think that some people, it depends on, I'm trying to think if I've definitely gotten the vibe from spirits sometimes that they're just like, want nothing to do with you, like get out, you know.
Okay.
And that's fine, that's fair. I'm in their space. It's like someone walking into my house who I don't know, and they start waving all this equipment around. They're like, tell me your life story, and I'm like, I'm watching a movie, leave, you know. But I do think that some of them get a reputation, you know, like it's very easy to walk into a place, you know, like Eastern State Penitentiary and assume that every ghost there is bad. But that's why when I tell people like, hey, you've got to look back historically and even currently how people end up in jail. You know, there are plenty of people who are incarcerated who aren't necessarily bad people, but they took a horrible road for whatever reason, and they ended up there and are probably remorseful. Not all of them, of course, but you know, you meet kind of the gamut in those places. You can't assume you know who you're talking to, or that every spirit you encounter is going to be this like evil, mean person, or that the whole place is dark. But it is very easy to think that, because you walk in and most of these, like, but by the time you get into a jail or an old, you know, asylum or something, it is falling apart. It is so terrifying looking. Like, of course this place is haunted by evil. I am not leaving here without getting scratched. You know, that's just that's how you feel. But then sometimes you end up having kind of the most like compassionate and emotional encounters in places like that. So
another question as far as research that I think you'd be pretty qualified to speak to, at least, is what about locations like these, like Eastern State Penitentiary and the Villisca House, that see a lot of traffic, they see a lot of teams coming through? Do you find that I mean, does the activity or the presences, I don't know, are they affected by and maybe disinterested by the amount of traffic that comes through? Does it cause, I guess it's speculative, but you know what I mean? I mean, this is manifestations we assume are an energetic act. And so if there's people coming through all the time, I mean, wouldn't you imagine that would get absolutely old for them?
I would think so. And so that's why, you know, I encourage people when they go into locations that are heavily investigated to reach deep into their wheelhouse for questions and information. And, you know, you can't just go in like, you know, you can't walk into Waverly Hills and just start asking questions about tuberculosis, or are you a patient? Are you a nurse? Or, you know, just people tend to ask these very generic questions, and it's human nature, you know, we all do it. So I always tell people, like, do what research you can before you get there, not just about the location, but think about the time period. Mm-hmm. Think of historic events that happened then. Think of music that was popular then. Think of like things that like are very like deeply ingrained bits of information that might, like someone who's used to ignoring everyone might go, oh, what was that? I'm interested in talking about that, you know? And so, yeah, I don't necessarily think the ghosts leave or whatever. It just depends on what kind of activity it is. But I definitely think we've bored many of these ghosts with our antics at this point. You know, they're like, I've had them tell me my own equipment on like EVPs and stuff. I'll pull out like a K2 and I'll get an EVP that's like a K2, you know, and I'm like, oh, I'm sorry.
Not the K2 again.
It's not a K2.
You know, that's interesting that you say that. I haven't done a ton of investigating, but I've investigated like St. Ignatius and the Davenport Hotel in Spokane, Washington, and it's a beautiful place. But one of the things that has happened for myself and my co-investigator is that we'll sit there and ask questions and nothing happens with the objects. I mean, they're just sitting there. The flashlight is not doing anything. You know, the REM pod's just idle, and we're just sitting there. And then we'll just start a conversation between us. And suddenly it's like you say, that's a great example. And then they just like all of a sudden the flashlight will turn on. It's like, oh, it's almost like they want to participate in a conversation, but not just be, you know, grilled, as you say.
Well, and that's just it, is that it's our nature because we're having a conversation with someone we can't hear. And so we just start peppering them with questions. And, it's hard sometimes even in group investigations where like I try to keep my questions kind of themed together so that they can, but then, sometimes you'll be like, okay, who was president? Who was your favorite president? Someone else will be like, when did you die? It's like you're trying to be like, and so it's sometimes kind of hard, but I do find that when you're just like I tell people like, don't be afraid to laugh, don't be afraid to have conversations, because that I think, influences them to answer just as much. Like, oh, I have something to say about this actually. So, and I also tell people, don't like come in with with equipment and whatnot. I like to walk in and just kind of set up my equipment all around and then not have a lot in my hands other than maybe a recorder, because I don't want to like intimidate them with all this weird stuff. They have no idea what it is.
Right.
And I explain everything, but then I think like some of them already probably know how to use it more than I do.
That's great. Through the course of all of this, I guess a question that I find very interesting is when you're doing these shows, I mean, obviously people are seeing the end result. We're seeing, these key points and things that happen. But first of all, is it when you're at a location, I know like when you were doing Kindred Spirits, you were there usually for several days, correct?
Yeah, when we film Kindred, we're there for usually 4 or 5 days. And it's the same really with any investigation. Like obviously when I'm not filming, I'm doing things that are more local. Although I did just wrap a show that we did like a whole town in like a week. So, the idea there is that you make your presence pretty familiar to whoever is there, so that they will talk to you more, gives you more time to like research in depth. I like to go in armed with research, but I also realize that sometimes evidence or activity will lead me down a whole other path, and I like to have time to go and figure that out, interview neighbors and people involved, and like it's a real time commitment. And so if I'm not doing something local, I like to be there for multiple days. So yeah, that's kind of the idea behind that is you can't really solve a haunting in one night. And really what it comes down to is most of the cases that I take on are very active. I like to help families or businesses. And they're kind of like, we need an answer, like what is happening here? They're being truly bothered by their haunting. And kind of going back to what we were talking about earlier about like, crossing things over. Everybody always thinks you have to cross it over. You got to cleanse the space.
Sure.
I find that to be very dismissive, to just assume that we who can't even prove the existence of these spirits have the nerve to come in and tell them what they need to do to move on. I think it's a belief system that we've built in ourselves to make ourselves more comfortable with the idea of dying. And so we put it on them. But just in my experience, I think that these spirits, when they are very active and insistent, usually want help with something. They need something. There's a message. There's, something left behind. They have that classic unfinished business. And if you can help them with that, many times the activity like declines or goes away completely. And so that's my version of crossing over. But it's a lot more labor intensive. It's a lot more work than our wishful thinking of waving around sage and hoping for the best, I totally get why people want that to work.
Sure. But
I've just investigated too many places that actually even stirred up activity because the spirits are like, no, I'm trying to tell you something. Why are you telling me to leave? So.
Another question about doing these shows, because I mean, for myself and all my listeners, we're in the outside looking in at these experiences, and again, I'm so grateful for your approach and how you do it. But how different is it? Well, obviously it's going to be different, but how different is it between when you're doing the investigations to the finished results?
What do you mean, like how different?
Obviously, these episodes are edited for content, and they have to be.
Oh yeah, like what you're seeing versus what actually happened. Oh yeah.
Yeah.
We're like with Kindred, because Adam and I executive produce and created it. Like we watch every episode multiple times before to make sure the story gets to you as pure as it actually happened. But when you're there for 5 days, you know, sometimes it's like, okay, we can't show this bit of evidence, or we can't show this part of the story, you know, and so there are parts that people definitely miss,
Sure.
but it doesn't, I don't think it affects the end result per se. Like there was we were doing the Palmyra Museum in Palmyra, New York, which is one of my favorite places to investigate. They're really great. And I'll never forget, we had these 2 pieces of evidence. We had a seance with all these like footsteps happening.
Ooh.
And then we also had this other piece of evidence with like literal, this like moaning, this, oh, and it was like the stereotypical ghost. And they were like, you can't have both of these. You have to cut one.
Oh.
We were like, oh, so we had to cut it. Moaning Myrtle is who we called her, the moaning ghost. But
Sure.
whenever I do my speaking tour, I always play that piece of evidence for people so they can hear it for themselves. So.
Oh, yeah, that's incredible. So, gosh, I mean, I know we're drawing close to the end, but this book is really an incredible venture, and I think it's the points that you brought up about these recipes being potentially triggering objects as well, I think is an incredible idea, because oftentimes we when you see trigger objects represented, there might be like a pistol, or, you know, as I mentioned, the rope, or some really negative part. But I think appealing to the positives, like the family meatloaf, for instance, and you know, that kind of thing, I think is really incredible, and we don't see enough of that. Have you utilized that kind of approach with trigger objects a lot in investigations?
It's funny you ask that, because I went through the whole process of making this book, making all these recipes, the whole thing, and it never even dawned on me to use these as trigger objects until people started asking me about it, because it's so obvious. Like, of course, you know what I mean? Like, and I just went, oh my gosh, like, this would be amazing, you know? Like, I'm sitting here like trying to like tell more stories and history and ghost stories and make yummy food, but then I was like, of course, you know, you could like make the Navy grog and bring it to the Star of India and offer it to the ghosts. You know, like you could make the Nutriloaf and bring it to Eastern State Penitentiary. They'd probably hate you, but they would, you know, it's like, and I just thought, I was like, of course, like, and so I'm sure people have tried this. I'm sure they have. But I know even, like, I live in a 300-year-old house. And so there were some of these really historic recipes I was making where I remember thinking, like, for a hot second, I'm like, does it feel weird in here? Like, is it because I'm cooking this like weird soup? Is that, you know what I know? And then now it just seems so obvious. So yes, if anybody utilizes these recipes in investigations, I want to hear about it. If you bring the Alcatraz sugar cookies to Alcatraz, I want to know. I mean, it's just, it is so wild to me that I never thought of that. You know, the fried chicken from Missouri State Penitentiary, you should make that and bring it to Missouri State Penitentiary, and then you can have it for dinner. You know, like you can have it for a snack. Yeah. I don't know. Yeah. So anyways, I have not tried it personally, but I fully intend to. I
think it's brilliant, and you know, and I'm sure it's a family pleaser as well. But I got to ask you one more question, if you don't mind.
Oh, yeah.
Have you ever had anything follow you home following an investigation?
Only a couple of times. And people ask me, this is probably the question I get more than any other question. Only a couple times, and neither time was it something evil or, you know, it's not, I think people are like, have you had an attachment? And I'm like, do you think this spirit just like latches onto you like a giant like spider? Is that what you know, when you think attachment? In both cases, one I think was a small child. It was when I was pregnant. And then in the other case, it was someone who just really was not done talking. And I could tell that when I was investigating that they were not done. And so I just always set really healthy boundaries, like I would if a living person was in front of me. And I felt like they were about to follow me. I would remind them how inappropriate that is, like it's a little creepy. And I think sometimes they get embarrassed, like they get excited because they're talking and they're having all this stuff. And then when you remind them, like, okay, I'm leaving, you're staying here. And they're like, oh yeah, of course, like, duh. You know what I mean? And so that's kind of the perspective I put on it. And people always ask me, like, how do you protect yourself and stop that from happening? And on a personal level, I don't like to put my faith into like a crystal or a prayer or religious metal. Like a lot of people feel like that protects them in some way, and I totally respect and understand that. But I know that if I truly believed something like that was protecting me and then I forgot it or something, I would instantly feel vulnerable and weaker. I would be, I'm a highly superstitious person already. And so I just go into every investigation just knowing that I'm enough. I don't need anything. I'm good. I'm strong. I always walk in like really rested and not any like weird mental stuff going on. Like I'm just very clear and grounded, and that's how I protect myself. So.
Oh, I think that's amazing and well said. I think that, people believe things, sure, it certainly becomes true for them. But in your case, you're just,
Curses only have power if you believe in them.
Right, exactly. Very true. I just really am grateful that we finally connected, Amy, because I find you to be a wonderful person, both in what you've presented to the world and furthering this conversation of our, the paranormal awareness and making it okay. In a lot of cases, all of your body of work has certainly helped to make people feel like they can talk and they can find help and guidance and such. So first and foremost, thank you for all you've done through your career. Your contributions are greatly appreciated and noted.
Thank you.
And
thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Absolutely. I'm first and foremost a fan because I love how you guys do things in a very respectful and tasteful manner. You're not sensationalizing it, but also this cookbook is brilliant. And I love thumbing through it. And you mentioned the croissant bread pudding. I saw that recipe and I'm like, ooh.
That one it's amazing. My family requests that one on the regular. But I told them, like, we can't keep eating this. This is very bad for us. But it is so good. So for special occasions, highly recommend.
Absolutely.
But there are plenty of other healthy options in there too. So.
Yeah. And the prison food, you can.
Listen, you need to get the family in line. You're like, tonight's a Meatloaf night. This is what you get.
Go to your room and you're getting Meatloaf. That's it. But thank you for taking the time to be here. Now the book will be out July 30th.
That's correct. Yep, it's available for pre-order everywhere now. Yeah.
And where can people get that book?
Anywhere books are sold.
Okay.
So if they go to my website, amybruni.com, they can learn about the book, they can learn about my appearances, they can learn about the Paranormal Circle, which is like my online membership community all about the paranormal. But there's also an entire page dedicated to the book that tells you all the retailers that are currently selling it already for pre-order. But if you don't pre-order it, it will be everywhere. Walmart, Costco, Sam's Club. It's kind of crazy. Yeah.
Well, it's been a rare pleasure having you on, and I hope we can connect sometime in the future because I've really enjoyed this talk.
That.
Well,
awesome. Well, thanks so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it as well.